This past weekend, Alabama dismantled LSU 55-17. And after the game on Twitter, there were a lot of people out there who were heavily critical about LSU head coach Ed Orgeron. There was a lot of people out there saying that Ed Orgeron was overrated, that 2019 LSU national championship was a fluke, and that Ed Orgeron was not going to last any longer as the head coach of LSU football. Now, me being me, and please don't ask me why, I got into a lot of heated debates on Twitter with the people who were saying that Ed Orgeron was only going to last 2 more years as the head coach of LSU football, that Ed Orgeron was overrated. And don't ask me why I was going back and forth with these people. Like, now that I think about it, like, why was I going back and forth with these people? Like, I guess it's because I love sports and I love debating people, but I'm not an LSU fan. So the guys that I was going back and forth with on Twitter, I don't know if they were just your average college football fan or if they were most likely an Alabama fan. But it seems like all logic and all common sense was just thrown out the window. This is why I don't argue with people on social media, because I just feel like people are just too biased. Like, they let their emotions and they let their fandom get the best of their judgment. So I don't understand how Ed Orgeron is overrated because people quote unquote say that Joe Brady and Joe Burrow were the reason why Ed Orgeron even won a championship with LSU last year. Like, so you're going to tell me that Ed Orgeron just deserves no credit for playing a role in LSU winning the national championship in 2019? Like, who recruited Joe Burrow from the transfer portal to LSU? Ed Orgeron. Who got Joe Brady on his staff last year? Ed Orgeron. Who helped develop the players that are now, the majority of them, playing in the NFL this season? Ed Orgeron in that coaching staff of LSU. So I don't understand why there are people out there that try to discredit Ed Orgeron and the role that he played in LSU winning the national championship in 2019. Because let me tell you guys something. It doesn't matter how good of a team you have if you don't have a good coach. So I don't understand why there were people on Twitter who were trying to say that Ed Orgeron only had like 1 or 2 years left as head coach at LSU. Let me tell you guys something. I think that Ed Orgeron has a pretty bright future and a pretty long future ahead of him as the head coach for LSU football. I don't think Ed Orgeron is going anywhere anytime soon as head coach at LSU. Okay? Now, I understand that LSU has not had a great season. But let's be honest. The majority of us knew that heading into the season that LSU was going to be retooling. LSU is not a program that, like at Alabama, can just lose a bunch of guys to the NFL and just, boom, they have guys right back up and they're right back in the national championship picture. That's not what LSU is, okay? And I'm going to tell you guys the reason for that in a little bit, but I just don't really understand why there was a lot of people on Twitter who were just trying to discredit Ed Orgeron and the success that he has had at LSU. Okay, he got blown out by Alabama 55-17. Okay, Alabama made a statement for what happened in the LSU locker room last year. I understand that. Okay, I understand that Nick Saban and Alabama felt some kind of way about how LSU went about their win against Alabama last year. Okay, Alabama wanted to lay a statement for what happened to LSU and how they handled their victory last year against them. I understand that, okay? But to just try to discredit the success that Ed Orgeron has had at LSU just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Now, LSU, here's the problem with LSU, okay? LSU is going to have to make some changes on that coaching staff. No doubt about that. And I have a feeling that changes will be made after the season. There was a moment during the game that Ed Orgeron just went absolutely ballistic. I mean, he was just really upset. I believe that he broke his headset. Like, he was just going absolutely berserk. And there were people on Twitter who were criticizing Ed Orgeron about that. I was telling people, I said, what coach in college football is not emotional? What coach in college football doesn't make their headsets? Now listen, the majority of the coaches in college football nowadays that are emotional, that break their headsets, happen to be some of the best coaches in college football. I didn't see nobody criticizing Nick Saban when he broke his headset against Auburn last year. Like, there are coaches who get upset and get angry all the time. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with a head coach who shows emotion, who shows passion. As a matter of fact, the coaches who show emotion and who show passion happen to be, the majority of them happen to be some of the best coaches in college football. Nick Saban, he gets emotional. He shows passion. Dabo Swinney, he's emotional. He shows passion. I mean, there are a lot of coaches. PJ Fleck. Okay? So, I mean, some of the best coaches in college football happen to be really passionate and really emotional during games. And as a college football head coach, you kind of have to be that. Now, you do have your more composed guys, like Urban Meyer was pretty composed. Ryan Day's pretty composed. I'm not saying that every head coach is emotional, that always, has tantrums on the sidelines and things like that. But when you're a college football head coach, I think that is kind of a good quality to have, because you're a college football head coach trying to recruit 18 and 19-year-olds, and the majority of these guys are like 40, 50 years old. So players have to connect with you. And one way that players can connect with you is that if you share their passion and their love for the game of football, if you care just as much as about winning and losing as the players do, players connect to that. No player wants to play for a head coach who is a robot. So the passion that Ed Orgeron shows and he coaches with, I think that is a really good trait. And that's why, in my opinion, I believe that Ed Orgeron and LSU is such a great program when it comes to recruiting. Now, the problem with LSU is not talent. As a matter of fact, LSU, for the majority of times, always has a pretty talented roster. I think the problem for LSU is not Ed Orgeron. So let's clear that out the way. It's a shame that I even have to say that Ed Orgeron is not the problem, but you do have a couple of people out there who I guess they either A, haven't been watching college football that long, or B, they're just super biased Alabama fans, or C, I guess they just don't have a brain at all. But common sense would tell you that Ed Orgeron is not the problem. The problem at LSU is the fact that they bring in these talented recruiting classes. They have talent, but they don't develop quarterbacks all that well. Aside from Joe Burrow, the last time I can remember LSU at least having at least a serviceable quarterback at best was Zach Mettenberger. That's the last LSU quarterback I can remember in recent memory, ever since I first started watching college football back in 2010, that was actually pretty solid for LSU. Okay, so for LSU, if you want to get back to a national championship, you're going to have to eventually learn how to develop a quarterback. And I think that is going to be the next task that Ed Orgeron is going to have to be able to do, because Les Miles, who used to be the head coach at LSU, was never great at developing quarterbacks. And that was something that held him back. Remind you that LSU had guys like Odell Beckham, Jarvis Landry. LSU produces great wide receivers year in and year out in the NFL. Justin Jefferson. Okay? So the talent coming out of the LSU offense heading into the NFL is getting held back by LSU's struggles to develop quarterbacks. Okay? And for Ed Orgeron, he's going to have to find out ways to develop the young quarterbacks that he has on this roster. Now, Miles Brennan, like I mentioned earlier, has been injured for the majority of the season. So he has been rotating between quarterbacks TJ Finley and Max Johnson. Now, eventually, one of these two guys is hopefully going to be the future at quarterback for LSU football. And for LSU to take that next step and to get back into the national championship picture, they're going to have to develop a quarterback. That's something that LSU has struggled with for a very long time. They don't really have consistent quarterback play. And in college football nowadays, this isn't what it used to be back in 2011, 2012, when you can just put anybody at quarterback and just have a run-heavy offense. Like, in this day and age of college football, you have to have a superstar quarterback. And the difference between Alabama and LSU is the fact that LSU has always had NFL talent on their roster. They always recruit really well. The difference is, yes, Alabama has slightly out-recruited LSU over the last couple of years, but the big difference is because Alabama is just much better at developing quarterbacks than what LSU is. And if you don't have a great quarterback in college football, the majority of the time, you're not going to be in that national championship picture. At best, with a above average college football quarterback, you can go to a conference championship game. But you're not going to get any further than that. You're going to have a transcendent talent at the quarterback position. And that's going to be the next thing that Ed Orgeron and his LSU staff is going to have to figure out. They're going to have to figure out what they have at quarterback, and they're going to have to eventually find a quarterback who they can bring in, recruit, and develop into the next superstar. Because you look at Alabama, they had Jalen Hurts, who was pretty good. You had Tua Tagovailoa, who was pretty good. Now you got Mac Jones, who is also pretty good. Mac Jones is going to be a first-round pick depending on if he goes in the NFL draft this year or next year. Tua Tagovailoa went it in the first round last year. Okay, you look at A.J. McCarron. A.J. McCarron was pretty good. So for LSU, if you ever want to get back to being a national championship contender, you're going to have to get way better at developing quarterbacks than what you have been able to do over the last couple of years. And aside from Joe Burrow, they haven't really had any great quarterback play. Joe Burrow is the difference. So for LSU, if you can't find out ways to develop the young quarterbacks that you have on your roster, or you can't figure out ways to develop the young quarterbacks that you recruit, you're never going to get to the level of Alabama, because every year in the transfer portal, yeah, there may be a couple of good quarterbacks or two, but at best, you're not going to find a Joe Burrow again. Okay, you're not going to find that great of quarterbacks in the transfer portal every single year. So eventually, there's going to come a time when you're going to have to develop your own young quarterback, like Oklahoma. Oklahoma got Baker Mayfield, they got Kyler Murray. All of those quarterbacks were transfers. Okay, but eventually, now it came a point that LSU has to become Oklahoma, and they have to be able to develop the young quarterback that they have on their team. And for Oklahoma, Lincoln Riley had to do that this year with Spencer Rattler. And Spencer Rattler had his growing pains, but Spencer Rattler has had a pretty good campaign in his first year starting at Oklahoma. So for LSU, you're going to have to get to that point when you're going to have to be able to develop your own quarterbacks instead of always relying on the transfer portal. Because eventually there's going to come a time where the quarterbacks in the transfer portal aren't really going to be all that great. So for LSU, if they can't find ways to develop the young quarterbacks that they have on their roster, they're never going to catch up to the level of Alabama. Because remind you that LSU has always had really talented teams. But the deciding factor on why the talent of those teams has always been held back has been because of the quarterback play. So for LSU, you can bring in these great wide receivers, you can have a great offensive line, you can have a great defense, but it's not going to matter if you don't have a great quarterback to go along with it. So for Ed Orgeron, I think that is the big problem. It's not just a problem with him, but this is a problem that has been with LSU and this football program for pretty much a decade. So for Ed Orgeron, his next challenge is going to be finding out ways to develop the young quarterbacks that he has on his roster. And that's going to go into bringing in better coaches on his staff and things like that. So that is the biggest problem, in my opinion, with LSU football. You guys let me know how you guys feel about it down in the comment section down below. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel for more college football videos and content. And thanks for watching.